evening to you on behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub. I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our weekly live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what this wildly unprecedented moment in history means for our province, this country, the economic system, and specifically the climate crisis. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Eoxie Nakota Nations, the Métis Nation of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I'd like to make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsor, Skyfire Energy. Skyfire has been designing and installing solar PV systems for homeowners, business owners, utilities, municipalities, and First Nations since 2001. They're an employee-owned, certified B Corporation with offices in Calgary, Edmonton, Penticton, and Regina. Their staff is one of the most experienced and qualified teams in the industry, having completed many of the largest and most complex solar projects in Western Canada. Their vision is to bring the magic of solar power to the world for a stronger, healthier, and more sustainable global community. We're glad to have you on board, Skyfire, and furthermore, Canada's going to need you in the time to come. Tonight's guest is Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon. Sara is a research fellow at the School of Public Policy, where her research is focused on low-carbon energy transitions at the intersections of policy, business, and technology. Sara is also, amongst many other things, she is a senior fellow at the Pembina Institute, where she leads the Business Renewable Centre of Canada. You can read her op-eds in the Globe and Mail and the CBC, many of which lay out industries and opportunities that could make Alberta a winner in the transition to the future. Sara Hastings-Simon, welcome to A Climate of Change.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. First up, I'd just like to get your lay of the land right now. Where are we? What does this moment mean?
Well, there's obviously a lot going on. And I like to separate kind of, there's the, before COVID time, there's the real sort of the health crisis that we're dealing with and the economic crisis that we're dealing with right now. And then looking ahead, there's that period of kind of recovery and rebuilding that we'll move into. And so, if you wind back to the clock before we started, sheltering in place and really doing our part to help the health of our country, we were in the midst of a pretty dramatic energy transition already, right? So we already had, obviously most recently, some of the significant increase in production from different oil producing countries, that was impacting supply and prices. But we had also a pretty massive shift in the energy systems more broadly, and that was really starting, continuing to pick up steam and continuing to grow. And so going into kind of where we are now, I think it's important to keep that in mind, right? So we're going to talk about energy transition. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the energy industry now as a result of the pandemic, but there was a lot going on before as well too. Where we are right now, obviously, we've seen quite a dramatic drop in demand for electricity and for oil. So we've gone down about say 30%, let's say, in the barrels demand now. And we are, this is a period of crisis, and it's not, yes, emissions are down as a result, but this is not the way that we want to see the world tackle emissions going forward. It's not a blueprint for that, let's say. But coming out of it, we know that there will be a lot of investment from governments looking to stimulate the economy, looking to build new projects, looking to bring people back to work. And so I think coming out, we're going to see that forces of the energy transition that we saw going into this continue, and perhaps in some cases even be accelerated through, some of these infrastructure projects that are, have a climate target.
So, yeah, I agree with all of that. For the first time, I've never heard of anything going negative in price. like the negative oil thing. And I understand it's a little more complicated, and it was only a special set of circumstances for a day or so. But I don't even know. I'm not an economist, so I'm not familiar of when that sort of thing has happened before. I guess I want to know, what does it mean for Calgary, the capital city of oil and gas in Canada, to have experienced negative oil, followed by a fast-growing global stockpile?
Yeah, so I mean, it's relatively unprecedented. I think my understanding is that, truly negative prices like that have not happened before. As you said, I mean, it's sort of, that's the price at which it was trading on the spot market, and there's a lot of caveats around that. But what it represents is just a very dramatic, swing within the oil markets. And it kind of, obviously that's coming from this dramatic decrease in demand, coupled with the increase in production that was already underway. What it is not so different, or what the oil industry has experienced before, is volatility, and the volatility. So these swings in prices up and down is increasing, right? So this is obviously a very extreme form of that. But over the past couple of decades, we're seeing a lot more volatility than we've seen before, and so this is, you could see that as an extension, I guess, of that point. It's, I think it's impactful for the industry in Calgary. I think people are starting to kind of wrap their head around the idea that, yes, we've seen oil price declines previously, right? And that while in those cases, in kind of previous recessions within the city, things turned around when the prices started to rise, there's a growing number of, reasons that this time is looking a lot different. And so that is, the fact that we're starting to see, there's a growing kind of consensus that, pick exactly the year, but that, peak oil demand is coming. And that growing volatility, those things combined, make the kind of projects that Calgary, that Calgary companies pursue even harder to move forwards on, right? So, with the introduction of shale oil and some of these shorter term, smaller capital amounts projects, the projects in the oil sands that are large, they take a lot longer. It's a lot harder as an investor to wrap your head around making, a multi-decadal investment at this time. And so, I think it's what it means for us in Calgary is really, having to start to think more seriously about where does our future growth and future job increases come from, because obviously we're going to continue to be producing oil, but there's that distinction between producing from the existing projects that we have and new production, which is a lot of what's really driving most of the job growth.
So just to stick with oil for a minute here, like you had mentioned, oil and gas in this province and globally have had a few hits, but specifically in this province, since about 2015, we just keep getting hit by global factor after global factor, from America becoming our number one competitor instead of our customer, to things like tech didn't want to build here, and to the Saudi and Russian oil games that get played that impacted us. Then we move it. All of that is before coronavirus. Then there's the coronavirus, and then there's this global stockpile. And I guess the question is, how soon can this province expect to rely on oil as our prime engine, and at what point can this province expect oil to come back in this province to the level that we can depend on it as we always have?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so forecasts are hard, right? As the saying goes, especially about the future. There's sort of two different pieces, I think, in that question. So one is more of, when does when do we arrive in a sort of more normal post-COVID state and start to see demand kind of go back to maybe around where it was, and when do we start to see stockpiles going down? That is something that I think will happen. And that will return us to a point of, the price is hard to predict, but, somewhat more normal, but on the low side of price. The other question of, when do we get to the point where you start to have investors that are saying, okay, now I want to go and build the next big project. I think that's the point that we may, we're starting to realize we may never get back to again, right? And what we'll see is companies, working to become as lean as they can. So that means, more automation, trying to reduce the cost of production, and continuing again to produce from those assets that are already existing, but not necessarily making new investments. And so as an engine, yes, there continues to be that engine of production and of revenues and royalties that come from that. But the engine of new projects and that creating the job growth is really, I think, a lot, starting to become a lot less clear that we'll get back to that point. Right.
Okay, so moving to the moment and where we're at right now, I feel like, other than when will everything safely open up again, the prime question, certainly asked by the climate conscious worldwide, is, will COVID trigger a global low carbon transition? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think we'll see in some ways an impact there, right? So I think, one of the biggest question marks that I think nobody really knows the answer to is, how will it change individual behavior, right? So will, and kind of behavior that's related to companies. So will a lot of companies allow people to start working from home? Will people make longer term changes to the way that they are traveling or not flying, things like that? And there, I think there's, we don't really have an event previous like this to kind of point to. So I think it's really hard to say whether, people will kind of just go back exactly the way things were before, or some of that will stick around. That's on the individual side. If you look at sort of more the energy system side, I think we know that there will certainly be spending coming out of the back end of this, whether it's a recession or a depression, whatever ends up happening here, governments will be putting into place stimulus packages. And those, I think, can serve to accelerate transition. We certainly saw it, coming out of the 2008-2009 period in the US, where there was significant spending that really went a long way towards, driving down the costs of solar and wind and increasing deployment in those areas. It also had an important role to play in really stimulating the early electric vehicle market that's brought us here today, both in terms of actually, loans that went to Tesla that actually enabled them to build their first manufacturing facility, but also to kind of requirements that were made on some of the big auto manufacturers that if they were going to get bailout money from the US, they would have to take action there as well too. So there's some pretty recent examples of stimulus money going in that direction. I think the government in Canada has, certainly made its intentions and some of its early actions clear that, they have a net zero target for mid-century. And so, stimulus is going to have to somehow be consistent with that target if that's something that they're sticking with. Similarly, the European Union has made some pretty clear statements there. In the U.S., a little bit more uncertain at the federal level, depending on what happens with the election. But at the states level, obviously, a lot of states moving ahead on that. And so just as an example, one of the mechanisms that I think we could see kind of this period ending up accelerating transition is actually through pausing some of our large infrastructure investments that would have otherwise happened over the next couple of years. And for something like vehicles, for example, so, we know vehicle sales are down, people aren't buying cars. There's been a bit of a debate of, electric car sales are going to go down because gas is cheap and because people aren't buying cars. But on the flip side, internal combustion engine car sales are down as well too. And so, there's certainly a scenario where we come out of this and you have a kind of big backlog of people who, we're waiting to make their vehicle purchase. And instead of making it, today, they're making it 2, 3, 4 years in the future, when they have a larger selection of electric vehicles, when the costs have come down some. and they may go straight to an electric vehicle when they otherwise would have bought a gasoline car. And so I think, similarly, that's an individual decision. Similarly, within the power sector, I think we're going to see a big pause on construction of new natural gas facilities. And as a result, then, see more renewables coming in than might have other in the short term to fill that in as well too. So, of course, there's this back and forth of, if energy is cheap, that's going to drive people's behavior to some extent. But some of that longer term kind of higher carbon infrastructure lock-in, I think may play more of a role there in the end.
Do you feel like it's sort of, looking back at this time, this will be the time that people in the future look back to, where some countries, where the winners and losers sort of choose themselves, because we do have to transition and we don't have the option not to do it. And we'll certainly see that some jurisdictions are going to, cling by their fingernails to the status quo, and others are going to see this as an opportunity. Does that jive with what you think it might happen globally?
Yeah, I think so. I think also different regions are better positioned to, transition. And for the challenges that a place like Alberta and Calgary has, for example, we also have a lot going for us, right? I think, when I can't sleep at night, my nightmare scenario is that we end up, like some of the coal communities in the US that have just been really, so hardly hit by the closures there, and are really struggling in a lot of ways, even more deeply than we are today in Alberta, is fair to say. But you look at kind of the makeup of those communities and the fact that Alberta has, much more highly educated workforce, is somewhat more connected to just geographically global markets. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for optimism that, we don't necessarily have to have Calgary be, left out of that transition. I think we have a lot of kind of the skills and abilities that are needed. But certainly places, individual regions will struggle. And that's where, government really has a clear role to play in helping to, make sure that everybody within a country or community is able to kind of come out on the other side of this.
Yeah. So my feeling is that Canada and the Liberal Party under Prime Minister Trudeau, it seems like they're interested in, and have always been interested in, the transition. It's not an easy thing to do, and nobody can turn on a dime, but my read has been like, okay, as a climate advocate, I've always felt that, okay, there's a partner there. I don't feel like I have a partner at the provincial level, and I think that's probably understandable to many people. At the provincial level, I feel like there's an ideological opposition to anything other than just oil and gas. And so being here in Calgary, again, capital city of oil and gas, but a city with all sorts of opportunities and smart people and great education and expertise and science and all of that, I guess I'm trying to figure out what is, if this jurisdiction wants to shift, are we going to have to go around our provincial leadership and partner with the feds? Is that how this works, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's hard to sort of be in the mind of the provincial government, and certainly, in recent days, there's been comments that have come out that are not at all encouraging, right, about kind of the idea of transition. That said, a couple months ago, there were comments made by the premier about, the need to think about, how Alberta kind of goes through a transition. So, I guess I still hold on to hope that, that we might manage to move forwards in a productive way. But I do think that, we do benefit, as you said, from the fact that there is a federal government that does, they have put in place this mid-century target, and they do have, an ability to support Alberta and Calgary through that transition. And in a way they have it, it's a bit easier, right? Like, there's a lot of there's a lot of work that people have done, understanding what drives so-called carbon lock-in. So, why is it so hard for economies to decarbonize? And certainly, the link between industry and political power and all these things are very hard to overcome. So, I think it's not unique that we have that challenge here in Alberta. But we do have, I think we do have a supportive federal government, and I think there was, for example, the recent announcement that they made about the funding for methane reduction and for addressing the orphan and inactive wells, is a great example of the way that the feds can support the province, and in particular, really the workers and the people of the province through that transition. So. I think we'll kind of see where the chips land provincially, but as you say, I think it's good to see that we do have that partner there.
Yeah. So for when we're thinking about a transition, I was really, as I mentioned to you before, I was really struck by your article about the minerals that we have access to in this province and in this country to build the renewable technologies from batteries and solar panels. And it seems to me like when we're trying to figure out what this New Deal is for Alberta, then one of those things is to look at stuff like that. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that opportunity.
Definitely. So there's a lot. I think one thing that's important to acknowledge is that, we're unlikely to find a single silver bullet where we say, okay, we can, pivot our entire economy and everybody that works in oil and gas is going to now work in this sector. I think we're going to end up with, if we're successful with an economy that has, a lot of different parts to it. And so things like technology, IT, there's a lot of role there as well. But that said, Alberta and Canada has a long history as a resource country. We have, to some extent, there's almost like a simple way to understand it, like we have a lot of space, so we have a lot of land, and there's a lot of stuff in that land. And the energy transition is about using and meeting our needs. So if we look at something like mobility, for example, or electric power generation, we're still going to want to get around. We're still going to want to be able to, turn on our lights. So it's not that we're going to stop doing those things, but we're going to achieve them in ways that are lower carbon and often, quite different. So through renewable power, through electric vehicles. And those still require materials, right? So there's kind of a list of critical metals and materials. And this is starting to get a lot of attention, just over the past kind of months and even almost weeks, just given everything that's gone on globally and kind of people's concern about, how much global cooperation there will be coming out of the pandemic. But this idea that for a lot of those materials, so everything from lithium, cobalt, and others, the U.S., Canada, big parts of Europe are really quite reliant on China for those materials, and there are a number of people that are concerned about that, and there's a lot of work that's kind of starting to go on about how could we address that. And so Canada does have deposits of many of these so-called critical metals and minerals. And there are people that have been working, very hard for a number of years to try to make these things happen, but it's very hard to do without, kind of a broader set of support. But the idea would be that, Canada and Alberta, for example, could shift from being a provider of essentially mobility and power through our oil and gas resource to provide mobility and power through our metals and minerals resource. And, you could put hydrogen in there as well too. If we can, produce those materials in ways that are, environmentally responsible, that are responsible and, respecting the rights of the Indigenous people to the land, really kind of raise the bar on the way that we are producing our resources and becoming a supplier of choice for those materials, I think is a huge opportunity, right? And that's where we can leverage a lot of the skills that we have from the engineering side, materials processing. If you think about Canada more broadly, around manufacturing as well, because you need to, produce these raw materials, but then you actually, need to get them to some stage along the value chain so that they can actually be, put into batteries, that kind of thing. And so there's huge opportunities there to really, take the skills that we have and look at the kind of adjacent areas from oil and gas.
So I just want to mention to our crowd or to our viewers that if you ask questions in the chat, we will be getting to them once we've gone through a little bit more Q&A here between me and Sara. And we also have a few guest panelists who will come up and ask a few questions as well. One of the things that I've talked to a few different groups that are talking about a Green New Deal in Alberta, and I personally use the phrase Alberta New Deal because we like to try to get that word. If the word green causes you trouble, then fine. Let's see you shoot down an Alberta New Deal. So in addition to the mining and the minerals, are there any other low-hanging fruit to you that Alberta could look to that can create jobs? And when I think about the sweet spot, I think the sweet spot it's something that's going to create prosperity, it's going to create jobs, it's better for our health, and it's better for the CO2. And having paid attention to sustainability for some time, it seems like a lot of times those solutions are a multiple level win, in that they usually end up being either cheaper to create or they're good for producing money, but then there's a sustainable value to them, etc. So are there solutions that you think would just be a dead simple, let's just do this for Alberta in addition to the minerals?
Yeah, I do. So I think that, in addition to what you're saying, kind of where you look for those opportunities, when I think about, what Alberta could do, kind of layering on that. So, what is the world going to need that we can produce, that we have somehow, as part of our economy today? And where do we have, in particular, some sort of competitive advantage or special skills such that, it's really going to happen here as opposed to somewhere else. And so in addition to the metals and minerals piece, I think agriculture is a huge piece, right? So, we know that there is a lot of work that still needs to be done to think about how we're going to feed the world in a sustainable way. We talk a lot about oil and gas, but Alberta obviously also has a really rich agricultural history and has done a lot of, really excellent work in agricultural technologies. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well in, thinking about how to produce food, more sustainably and with less energy and resource use. So, also less input materials as well. And so being able to export that food and also being able to export that technology and that know-how, because that's really become quite a high-tech area, right? I think saw a video on Twitter the other day that was going around of a young woman in the cab of her, I think she was seeding a field or something, and she had quite an impressive number of screens on things going on. So really there's a lot of, quite a big market in that space. So that's one that I'm quite bullish on, I guess you could say. The other is around decarbonization of the industrial sector more broadly, right? So in a sense, there's been a lot of focus on how we decarbonize personal transport, how we decarbonize the electricity sector, obviously all very important, and continued effort is still needed there. But even more work is really needed around decarbonizing things like cement production, metal, iron, steel, all of the kind of heavy industrial production that uses a lot of high heat, quite a bit harder to decarbonize and really still, at the early stages of figuring out what the right way to do that is. And so again, I think, if you look at Alberta's skills, at Calgary's skills of building large projects and really those engineering skills that, that we, I think, have in a way that almost nowhere else in the world does, directing those towards that opportunity of industrial decarbonization as well. Another one where we can both, have an impact locally, but ultimately be able to, bring those technologies and know-how that's developed, around the world as well.
So I'm going to ask you what maybe sounds like a crazy question, but I feel like sometimes crazy questions get interesting answers. If we wanted to, and we set ourselves up, could Alberta feed all of Canada?
That's a good question. I don't know. I would have to do the quick back of the envelope, how much space we have and how much food you can grow per unit. But I think that we certainly, along with obviously our prairie neighbor, have really significant food production. And I think, but that's one where I think we would, again, there's both the piece of kind of what you're doing here from an agricultural perspective, but then also what you're doing to export some of those skills. I think one of the things that, is really, as I mentioned before, kind of up in the air coming out of this period and even going into it, there has been a bit of, I guess you'd call it like a backlash almost against globalization and a lot of questions around, what makes the most sense for supply chains for food. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions there. It's certainly not an area of expertise for me, but they're often very complex questions, right? Because it's not always true that producing food further away and transporting it takes more energy, right? It depends a lot on what that production looks like and what the transport looks like, because there's quite efficient ways to transport things and inefficient ways. So it's certainly a very interesting area to ask questions in.
Well, I can just tell you that when Prime Minister Trudeau first talked about shutting down the border to America, but they were still letting Americans in, I was sort of raising the red flag on Twitter because I was just like, hey, it's a pandemic, shut down the border. I don't want to, but the pushback that I was getting, even from the left, was, hey, look, we don't want to upset that guy. If he decides to turn off the taps, and there goes all of our food and all this stuff. And so I feel like that might be a shift of the Overton window, that when it comes to how we get our stuff, now that we're a little more cognizant of borders.